Right, on to this now. Parliament's Portfolio Committee on Transport has rejected Minister Fikile Mbalula's plan to introduce a zero-alcohol driving law. It's one of a number of proposed amendments to address gaps and loopholes in the National Road Traffic Act. For more on this, we're joined now by Automobile Association spokesperson Layton, Road Transport Regulation Chief Director Johannes, Makgatho, and the Southern African Alcohol Policy Alliance's Maurice. And we're asking you tonight on 0721105584, why does a law that has the potential to benefit public health have to face such strong opposition? What are your thoughts on that? And of course, what do you make of the proposal of a 0% alcohol driving law being in place? We'll take those thoughts tonight on WhatsApp, also on Twitter. Gentlemen, good evening, and thanks so much for your time and for joining us tonight here on In Focus. Layton, I'm going to start with you because you're one of those who went strongly to oppose this particular bill as the AA in Parliament. Why does a law that has the potential to really benefit public health have to face such strong opposition? I don't think it's in dispute in many countries which have lowered the legal blood alcohol limit, that this certainly does bring a massive reduction in road deaths that have alcohol-related causes.
Good evening, Thabo, and good evening to your viewers and to the fellow panelists. Well, I mean, the first question I'd ask is, how is zero alcohol limit going to benefit public health? That's the first question, and in our view, it's not going to benefit public health to the extent that we're going to see reduced road crashes. The second point I want to touch on is that I think you're incorrect when you say that countries that have implemented zero alcohol limits have seen a reduction in road crashes. What we have seen is that better enforcement and better prosecution of offenders is actually leading the charge in terms of reducing road crashes and therefore road fatalities. We have existing laws in South Africa that are simply not implemented properly. They're not enforced correctly. So people are driving on our roads with no consequences, with no fear of consequences, and that is where the problem lies. In 2019, the Traffic Law Enforcement Review Committee, a committee established by the previous Minister of Transport, established that we need double the amount of traffic law enforcers on our roads than what we currently have. Right. Therein lies the answer to the question of how do we deal with drunk driving in South Africa. We simply need better law enforcement and we need better prosecution. You can't introduce a new law when you currently have up to 8% of prosecutions only for drunk driving and expect that that's going to have a huge impact on drunk driving. It's not. People who are going to want to drink and drive are going to continue to do that until there are severe consequences for that type of behavior. And you can legislate as much as you want. It's not going to help. I return you to what we've been saying all along, and I think the committee actually heeded our call. You can't legislate yourself out of a problem that requires boots on the ground. And that's exactly the situation we're in at the moment.
It is a fact, though, Layton. It's WHO's best practice. Countries like the United States who have reduced their alcohol limit from 0.08 to 0.05. They've seen a reduction in fatalities that are alcohol-related. Brazil actually has got a zero limit to alcohol. They've been fighting it for 10 years in the courts. They are also contending that reducing it has certainly seen a reduction in fatalities. So that is a fact, and there are a number of studies that are out there that certainly you can look at that seem to bear that fact. Yes, I mean, I'm not arguing the other issues that you're saying around enforcement, but I'm just talking on that point of just reducing just slightly from 0.08 to 0.05 has shown tremendous benefit. On top of that,
legislation is at 0.05, Thabo.
So, here's the other.
Africa that have shown that you can do as many studies as you want. I mean, the point that I'm making is that in countries like America and in Australia, their alcohol laws are backed by efficient law enforcement and by proper prosecution. Added to all of that is the fact that they've got labs that don't take a year to 14 months to process blood samples. Therein lies the problem. What you're actually doing by reducing or proposing to reduce the legal limit to zero, is you're making soft targets of those motorists who may be using alcohol in things like mouthwashes or who have what we call gut fermentation syndrome. It's not going to solve the problem. As much as we'd like to solve the problem through legislation, it's simply not going to have that impact. And again, I say, we can try and legislate this. It's not going to help. And that's exactly why Parliament's Portfolio Committee rejected that, because they've seen through that and sanity has prevailed. So we're obviously quite happy with the fact that that this hasn't happened. And we're also of the opinion that there are many other measures that government should be taking in order to reduce drunk driving, and they're not. This is apart from employing more traffic officers. There are other measures that should be taken that aren't being taken, and that's another point of concern for the AA.
Maurice, is the government making a sober decision here? Are the current legislative approaches to reducing alcohol-impaired driving adequate? I mean, including the lowered legal blood alcohol content limit sitting at 0.05%. Is that effective?
Hi, thanks, Thabo. Our position when we went to the Portfolio Committee at the end of 2020, when they were taking public comments, was that we thought if it was possible to reduce it to zero, it would be a good thing to do, because it's really important, particularly in South Africa, to disconnect drinking from driving. And that would be a very effective way of doing it. It would also have removed any ambiguity, because I think a lot of the time when people actually do get stopped and they are tested, there's some doubt about whether they actually have gone over the limit or haven't gone over the limit, depending on the method of testing and so on. So we thought it was a good idea to go to zero, and you gave an example of Brazil where it had a dramatically beneficial impact. However, we are, and I would disagree with Layton when he says it has no impact. On the other hand, I would agree with him that we need to have better enforcement. But our argument actually is that we feel the Portfolio Committee has failed to take the middle road. And by that I mean, in 2012, the Department of Transport initially suggested that the level be dropped from 0.05 to 0.02 for regular drivers and to zero completely for professional drivers, bus drivers, truck drivers, and so on. Then in 2015, they decided to say everybody should go to zero. When the Portfolio Committee was taking comments, many people, including Professor Charles Parry from the South African Medical Research Council, argued the point that Layton also argued now, that there is a problem with alcohol in medicine and various other ways that could read, between the 0.00 and 0.02 range. And so therefore they said, rather make it 0.02 and then have different levels of punishment for the different levels that people have. So if it's between 0.02 and 0.05, you would get punished less than if it was over 0.05. And we think that the Portfolio Committee, because the Portfolio Committee says that the reason they rejected the clause was for that very reason, was because of the presence of alcohol in medicine and mouthwash and so on. So we think that therefore they should have recommended to the department that they don't go to zero, but they go to 0.02. Yeah. Because what that would do, it would see a drop in the level, but it would also remove the challenge that Layton and other people have raised about creating a situation where people who have taken medicine with alcohol or mouthwash will not get prosecuted unnecessarily. And we also agree, I have to say, with Layton when we say we need better enforcement. And one of the things that we should be doing is introducing what's called random testing. Random testing means that you test anyone that you stop. On a period of time, you test anyone that you stop, regardless of whether you think that they've been drinking or not. Because what that does is it creates a culture in the country where people will become nervous about whether they might be stopped, whether they might be tested. Frankly, myself, I've been tested once in my life. I've been breathalyzed once in my life. for alcohol.
Right.
So even if I have been drinking, I'm not that particularly worried about being stopped because it doesn't happen.
Let's bring in Johannes Makgatho, Chief Director, Road Transport Regulation, as well to help us in this conversation. Dr. Johannes, please unmute for us, if you can, please, so that we'll be able to hear you in the conversation. But I read here a comment from the Portfolio Committee Chair saying, following extensive public hearings and engagements on the bill, the committee agreed with the majority of the submissions opposing the reduction of the blood and breath alcohol content for drivers to zero. Where was this opposition coming from? Where is the majority of this opposition coming from?
Well, good evening. It was from a variety of stakeholders, including the AAU, the alcohol industry, South African Catholics Bishops Conference, individual members of the public, quite a number of a variety of stakeholders.
I'm asking because there are some who are arguing that the most vocal opposition was actually coming from the alcohol industry itself.
Well, they made submissions. The record speaks for itself. So if you can go through the proceedings themselves, you'll see that there were inputs that were made by alcohol industry in this regard. So your statement might be true and correct. And then what I would want to say is that, coming to the rationale of why we sought to introduce, amongst others, 0%, you will recognize and accept the fact that South Africa has one of the highest road traffic death tolls globally, and alcohol is reported as the leading risk factor to these crashes. And this you can find in the Global Status Report on Road Safety 2018. Now, in addition to what Mr. Beard has said, we were under no doubt that reducing the BAC itself was going to be complemented by other strategies. And one of them was with reference to now, for example, increase random breath testing, look into mandatory testing of drivers at all crash sites where someone was killed or injured. And amongst others, the issue of law enforcement. We are working hard to ensure that we introduce 24/7 law enforcement, which is currently being piloted in one of our provinces, where issue of traffic law enforcement is a 365 24/7 event. Yes. So it was not going to be an isolated event where we simply put legislation and then we hope that everything else will work itself out. Yeah. Needless to say that this is having a tremendous effect on our public health system, and those are issues that
what Layton is arguing, and Dr. Makgatho, is that there is really no evidence and best practice for the creation of new laws and policies in this area. There's no evidence that supports it. Did you have evidence to support it when you embarked on this particular exercise?
Look, there were researches that were done. Reference was made to Dr. Charles Perry's inputs. Cost of crashes, and if you can look at our stats, cost the country over 180 billion rands. So that on its own will simply tell you that there is an issue here that requires attention. Other than that, people are dying unnecessarily as a result of people that are intoxicated, right? And that is a problem, and that is a concern that we have as a government and as the Department of Transport. By the way, in addition to that, we were proposing quite a number of measures
Yes.
like I made reference
Yeah.
to.
We'll talk a little bit more about those reforms that you're proposing and what do they actually mean. But let's take your thoughts tonight. We'll continue in a moment. 072-110-5584. Why does a law that has the potential to benefit the public health, even you hear that from the Portfolio Committee itself, have to face such strong opposition? Of course, it has faced opposition, and the Portfolio Committee has said we're going to have to stick with what we have right now, 0.05%. Blood alcohol content limit is where it stays, and for professionals at 0.02% limit. We'll talk more on this and get some responses as well from Layton to the conversation so far. In Focus continues shortly. Welcome back. We're live with you tonight. And the conversation is on the 0% alcohol limit for drivers. Of course, a proposal and an amendment which has been rejected at the Portfolio Committee on Transport. There have been a number of submissions made, including one from the Automobile Association of South Africa, including, of course, those in the industry. So, Layton, there is that argument, and I saw you shaking your head, that one of the most vocal oppositions is from the industry itself, which many are arguing that it's quite bizarre, because in countries where the limit has been dropped, there has been no significant economic impact on the industry itself. But two, it's that they are separating the relationships, as Maurice is saying, between drinking and driving. It's not about whether you should enjoy your beverage or not, but it's about whether or not you should get behind the wheel. Don't you think it would have been a much more productive exercise to get input opposing this from other quarters except for the alcohol industry itself?
Well, the reason I shook my head was because I don't think the alcohol industry was the most vocal opposition to this. I mean, the Automobile Association is incredibly opposed to this for a number of reasons. One, because we are very concerned about, as Mr. Makgatho said, the very high road death fatalities that we have on our roads annually. And everything is being thrown to the way of alcohol, but we're not looking at other issues in South Africa that contribute to that. And we talk about issues such as improved traffic law enforcement. But we're sitting with a situation where, for instance, the lead agency responsible for road safety in South Africa, the Road Traffic Management Corporation, has a surplus in its budget of 162 million rand in a financial year. And then we want to say, well, that's not the problem. The lead agency for road safety has a surplus in its budget. We have this huge problem with road fatalities and with road crashes. But that surplus isn't the problem. This is the problem. And let's legislate and let's put laws in place that are going to deal with that problem. And our concern is that that's not going to happen. Mr. Makgatho also says about, we had all these plans in place. We were going to do random blood tests and samples at roadblocks. Obviously, we are not opposed to any of that, Tom. What we're saying is that get your structures in place and then legislate according to what your structures are able to do. But what you're doing is the reverse of that. You're trying to legislate a problem that doesn't require legislation because you've already got laws that should be effective. They're good laws. Yeah. They're just not enacted properly. Yeah. We say that side of it sorted out, and then we can put these other structures in place.
Sorry, Layton, let me just jump in there. So you're saying there is no absence of legislation, but do the laws need reform? I mean, is there something that we can do in the current laws to strengthen them? Is there something that we can do to complement the existing laws?
No, there's nothing wrong with the laws. That's the point. The laws are fine. It's the enforcement of the laws that's the problem. If you're going to tell me that you're going to bring in a piece of legislation that says you cannot have one beer and get in your car, that the person who goes to a pub on a Friday night is going to say, well, the law says that I can't do that, therefore I'm not going to do it, that they're not going to do it, of course they're going to carry on doing it. If the law says you cannot have 2 or 3 beers and drive drunk, and if the law then is supported by proper enforcement, where when that person gets in the car and they drive around the block, there's a roadblock or there's police officers that stop them and they take their blood and breath samples, and those samples are processed within a month, and that person then gets to court, and the courts then play their role, and that person is then prosecuted, and everybody can see there's a consequence to drunk driving, then certainly you are going to divorce this issue of drinking and driving. But to simply say we've got a law that says you can't do it without any of these other structures, or to promise that you're going to have these structures in place down the line, is not going to solve anything. And that's the point that we make.
Makgatho, is there an implementation challenge here? And is the department willing to admit, and the structures and the bodies that are in the transport sector willing to admit what Layton is saying, that there's an implementation challenge? Yes, the laws are in place, but they are, for example, poorly enforced in things like the testing that needs to be done, those samples coming back on time, ensuring that there are penalties in place that fit the kind of offense, and those penalties are enforced as they should be.
Okay. I started off by stating the following, that we are seeking to implement 24/7 strategy, which seeks to say that there will be boots on the ground 365 days of the year.
Yeah.
Right. So that proposed amendment was not going to be something that was going to be put in.
No, but my question is a little bit more direct. It's different to what you're answering. I'm asking you, before the amendment, are you willing to admit that there's an implementation challenge currently, right now, besides the amendment being put in place? I understand you saying in the future we plan to put more boots on the ground and so on. It's fine. I'm saying right now, are you willing to admit that there is an implementation challenge? And if so, what is the challenge in implementing what is currently there?
Like I said, I alluded to there being, look, you have traffic officers. In terms of the stats that you have, Mr. Mbalula, this is what happens. We know that crashes happen on Thursday in the evening, right leading up to Sunday early morning. Now, the reason for that is that, amongst others, is that there aren't sufficient law enforcement officers on our roads. Okay? So, to that end, 24/7 implementation seeks to address that.
Yeah.
2, we are now going to, amongst others, work on improving our public transport.
Yeah.
Right? In that way, right, there is that spin-off of there being new jobs in the e-hailing industry.
Right.
The other point is that, which was made reference to, increase the random breath testing. Yeah. Now, what we're doing is we're working on effecting amendments to legislation. Yeah. That being the case, legislation development and putting measures in place requires a consultative process, and within the space that we operate, it's not something that the department can do on its own without meaningfully engaging with the provinces and local municipalities, as it is the case.
But Dr. Makgatho, I'm sure you are aware, because I'm sure you're a signatory to it, the WHO best practice and protocol when it comes to the assessment of legislation that governs this particular area of alcohol-impaired driving. One of the things that they say is that assess the laws that are already in place. If there's no absence of legislation and there is law in place, the first thing that you do instead of putting new laws is to ask the question, how do we strengthen what is already there? How do we support what is already there so that we complement the law? So you don't go and make a new law. If the challenge is there are not enough officers on the ground, why is the solution not let's get more officers on the ground before you want to change the law?
In terms of what we're doing now with what I've made reference to, that's what we're seeking to do. And it is not true and correct that RTMC, based on the surplus, there is work underway that we are doing. There are research reports that have been put out between the RTMC, Medical Research Council, UNISA, on issues related to the effects of alcohol. So there are reports out there, and you can simply log on to the RTMC's website, look for that, you'll get access to those.
There's one report that was released in 2018.
Okay, let me allow Mr. Beard to finish off, and then I'll proceed.
Layton, you're saying there's only one, and Mr. Makgatho says there's sufficient that is out there.
Well, I mean, I'd be very happy to see the other reports that he's alluding to, and I'll certainly go on the RTMC's website after this broadcast and have a look. But the only report that I'm aware of is the one that was released in 2018 that says anything between 27% and 30% of crashes, or it actually just says 20% of fatal crashes are attributable to alcohol usage. But again, I'm listening to Mr. Makgatho, and, we're going to be doing this. We've got these plans in place. We are proposing that we're going to do that. That's all things that are going to happen. That's all stuff that's in the pipeline. I think the point is that if you're faced with a crisis, and let's be very clear about this, our national road safety is a crisis. It's a national crisis in South Africa. We have 13,000 people that die a year, and we're still talking about making plans on how to deal with it. We're still talking about we're proposing this, and we are going to do this, and we're going to invest in this going forward, and that's what's going to happen in future. No, these are things that need to happen immediately. But instead, we are fixated on creating a law that is going to reduce alcohol levels from 0.05 to 0.00, all of which is going to happen within the current enforcement environment, within the current laboratory environment, within the current prosecutorial environment. That's where, and you made the point, and I agree totally with you. Let's strengthen those before we start looking at bringing in legislation. You're putting the cart before the horse if you do it any other way around.
Let's take a break and take your thoughts. 072-110-5584. Dr. Makgatho, I'll give you a chance to respond and come back to those issues when we return from the break. We'll take your tweets as well at Newzroom 405. Maurice, I'm going to bring you in because I want us to debate a little bit this question of this 0.02%, if it really is okay. Because some studies are already, for example, showing reduced peripheral vision at 0.02% of alcohol, whether it be by medication or any other thing. Do we want those people behind a wheel in any way? All right, let's take your thoughts when we continue in a moment. Back live with us tonight, John in Focus, and thanks for staying on. Your thoughts tonight on 072-110-5584 to the question, why would a law which has a potential to improve public health be receiving such opposition? Mutibi in Auburn saying zero alcohol won't make a difference. People who have been involved in accidents under the influence of alcohol have been found to be in excess of the current limit. So Mutobi saying that, well, if they are breaking this current limit, what is to stop them from breaking the 0.0% limit? For people to stop this thing of drinking and driving, alcohol should be banned in South Africa completely. Anonymous there coming through on WhatsApp. Keep them coming, 072-110-5584, or you can tweet us at Newzroom 405. Dr. Makgatho, let me give you an opportunity to respond then. You're saying there's adequate reporting that is out there on a number of platforms that certainly support your view.
Yeah, one of them is the report that Layton Mr. Beard made reference to, the 2018 report by the RTMC. But then, every time and as and whenever there is a need to report on stats, which our Honorable Minister does, we always make reference to or include crashes that occurred as a result of drinking and driving. May I also hastily state, Mr. Mbalula, that, we have 4 test laboratories in our country when it comes to issues related to testing of the blood samples and so forth. Yes, there might be problems attendant thereto, but then in our engagements, we also consulted the Department of Health in this regard. So it's not all doom and gloom in that we seem to be sitting back and coming up with unreasonable legislation, to the extent that we are sitting with a problem here, and that is people are dying, right? Yeah. And some deaths are unnecessary, right? That's one point. Second point to make is that with regard to the issues related to somebody taking in medication, you are warned, right? There is a clear warning on the label itself or on the bottle or whatever one would be taking in, that there would be side effects which might lead to drowsiness or blurred vision or dizziness and so forth. So if you are to go behind the wheel and drive, that might create problems for you. There are those kind of warnings that are there, we know about them. It's not something that is new. Right? But the idea is...
I suppose the argument is then, do we criminalize those people?
Now, here is what happens. For every, if at all somebody were to be taken on and try to establish the level The question is, does that impair the person's ability to drive? But ideally, you would not want to be found behind a vehicle whilst you are intoxicated.
Yeah. Maurice, let's bring I'm going to come back to you. Maurice, let's bring you in here. I mean, it is, of course, being argued, and others are saying, well, that's really not a good argument to make, because even at 0.02%, for example, there have been studies that show reduced peripheral vision. There have been studies that show, for example, reduced ability to steer out of emergency situation. I mean, your attention level is affected. You're not able to respond, for example, to multiple things that are happening at the same time, even at 0.02%.
No, that's true. And the other thing that has to be remembered is that different people respond differently to alcohol. So somebody who has actually had one beer, Layton referred to somebody having one beer. Some people who have just one beer actually are affected to the point that they are a risk on the road. Other people can have 3 or 4 beers and actually be probably in a better state. So there's no doubt that any intake of alcohol, that is what the definition of a psychoactive drug, which is what alcohol is. It's a psychoactive drug. The definition of a psychoactive drug is that it changes your mental state, and therefore your ability to be able to deal with certain realities. So we do need to bear that in mind. But I wanted to just say that I think that it's an incorrect argument in my view, in our view, to say that because we don't have enforcement of current laws, therefore you don't introduce new laws. The fact is that this law has been on the statute books for 10 years. It was initially proposed in 2012. And it has now taken 10 years to get to where it should, to where it is now, which actually it shouldn't have taken that long, but it has taken that long. In our view, it would be much better to take an appropriate decision for now and for the future, and at the same time then deal with the other issues that Layton has been raising. And we agree that there are many ways in which the law is not being enforced, which could be improved. But to argue that...
Sorry, Maurice, but what do you make to the point that Mutobi is raising? Because he's talking exactly about that it would provide greater legitimacy to the new laws if we provided appropriate implementation mechanisms for the current old laws that are in place. Because if people are breaking the 0.05% now, they are likely going to break the 0.0%, and nothing would still happen to them.
No, absolutely. I mean, the same argument has been raised about in the post-Enyobeni situation when 21 youngsters died in the Enyobeni tavern in June. One of the immediate things that the president said was, we should consider raising the age of drinking to 21. Yes, of course we should. And then there's a lot of very, very good argument as to why you should. Health reasons, brain development reasons, etc., etc., etc. But if you just were to increase the age of drinking and not do a whole lot of other things, including enforcing the law, then why would those same kids who were drinking underage when the law was 18, why would we imagine they would suddenly stop drinking when the age was 21? So on that point, we 100% agree that the way in which we deal with alcohol in the country has got to be holistic. You've got to look at all of the different aspects of alcohol in the country, which is how it's being sold, how it's being drunk, how it's being advertised, how the laws are being enforced. The power that communities have to have a say over how alcohol is used in their communities. All of these things need to be looked at. We need even to look at the economic underpinnings of why it is that so much alcohol is being sold in the country. I mean, we have an economic crisis in the country where there's massive unemployment, so people turn to selling alcohol and drinking alcohol because of the economic crisis in the country. So you've got to look at the big picture. But simply to say, that because all those things aren't in place, therefore you shouldn't change the law, that doesn't make sense. If the law needs to be changed because the legal process takes so long, change the law, but then at the same time make all the other changes that you need to make to give effect to that law. And that's the kind of thing that Mr. Makgatho and I were talking about, where you're talking about, for example, introducing random testing and so on.
Yeah.
Those things have to happen, but you can't. And the reality is that, as you said, I disagree completely with Layton when he said there's no evidence. Just in South Africa, we have evidence. During COVID, one of the consequences of banning alcohol during COVID was a dramatic drop in trauma presentations at hospitals.
Right.
And if you go and talk to hospitals, they will tell you that many of those presentations are of people who've been drinking and driving. And so there was also interpersonal violence, of course, which was reduced as well as a result of the alcohol not being there. But there's no doubt that alcohol and drinking and driving is actually causing deaths in the country. Right. And you can't say that because it's being caused by other things, therefore you shouldn't worry about the alcohol issue. You deal with each issue.
We're actually out of time, so I'm going to give Layton, literally, I probably have like a minute or so left. We are completely out of time. But the argument here is that we can both walk and chew at the same time. We don't have to say, no, we'll choose chewing and then we'll walk later.
Well, okay, look, quite frankly, Mr. Smithers is conflating the issues. The reason that the trauma units weren't as busy is because nobody was on the roads in the first place. I mean, there was a national lockdown. People weren't driving anyway. That's not, you can't make alcohol the boogeyman of every problem you have. That's the first point, and I will leave it there. The issue is a very clear one. We have for very many years had one of the worst road safety records in the world. We have anything between 13,000 and 14,500 people that die every year on our roads. Mr. Makgatho made mention of the cost of crashes. It's higher than 163 billion. Extrapolated, because that was a figure from 145 billion was a figure in 2015. Extrapolated with inflation is probably closer to 210 billion rand a year. So nobody's saying that alcohol isn't a problem in terms of drunk driving. That's certainly not what the AA's position is. We acknowledge that there is a problem with drunk driving in South Africa, and we think that something needs to be done about it. What we're saying is that you can't write a piece of legislation that's magically going to solve the problem. Mr. Makgatho talks about plans that they've got in future, and we propose to do this, and that's something that's in the pipeline. No, for us it's about let's deal with the 14,000 deaths we have on a year as a priority. And how do we do that? We make sure that people don't drive drunk, so we put breathalyzer equipment in vehicles, like the Britet that the AA sells and supports, so that people can't start a vehicle. It's an ignition inhibitor. That's the start. But instead we want to write legislation. Let's get more traffic officers. We've got a pilot of 365 and 24/7. Why is it a pilot? Why is this not being rolled out across the country? Why is that not the priority? But instead we want to write legislation. Let's beef up the labs. Mr. Makgatho acknowledged, yes, we have a problem with the labs. Let's make sure that's sorted out. We have a problem in the courts. That's where we need to prioritize. We can't legislate ourselves out of this problem. We need to be practical. We need to be moving forward, and that's going to happen through things that happen today, not things that happen in future, Mr. Makgatho.
Mr. Makgatho, let's wrap it up with you and giving you a minute. A multi-sectoral policy dialogue is something that we are talking to here, possibly. Maurice saying even the advertising industry, the media needs to come on board in this conversation. You've already mentioned engaging the health department, but you've already mentioned, for example, local government, because visibility sometimes is also another area where there needs to be lights, grass needs to be cut. It's a multi-sectoral policy approach more than just the 0.0%.
No, that's true and correct. That's why in enacting legislation, there is a process to follow. Otherwise, if you don't follow those due processes, you might be found wanting and your legislation will be challenged. So road regulation falls within those concurrent areas of legislative making where you need to under Schedule 4 of our Constitution, where you need to engage with your provinces and local municipalities. So it's through no fault of our own that certain processes take long, but then it's how things are being done, and we are cognizant of that fact. But then it's work in progress, and for what it's worth, in the Western Cape, 24/7 is being implemented, and we are meaningfully engaging in partnership with our entity, the Road Traffic Management Corporation, the RTMC, wherein we're engaging with the remainder of the provinces to ensure that this becomes a reality, Mr. Mzulu. So there is work, and by the way, for what it's worth, there is a proposal that Department of Trade and Industry and Competition has put forth back in 2016 around effecting amendments to the liquor bill.
Yeah.
Amongst others, it was going to propose that a variety of measures be put in place, including curbing alcohol advertising, increasing drinking age to 21 and so forth.
All right.
So it's a multi-pronged approach that government is embarking on, not something that we might have sat down in a corner somewhere and resolved that this is the route that we're going to take.
We're going to have to leave it there, unfortunately, because of time, but I appreciate you all. Thank you very much for coming on tonight and helping us in this conversation. Let's take the last bit of WhatsApp messages that have come through. 072-110-5584. McDonald saying, we know alcohol is the problem, but this corrupt and poor management of this government is one of the things that is killing our people on the road. Most of our busiest roads have one lane. Poor management of Transnet took away trains. Now we got too many trucks on the roads. Mr. Makgatho sounds like all other government people and politicians. Too much talking about less work. Mr. Beard has a good point. Mr. Makgatho must answer your question, why not work on the current laws before making new laws? Franklin from Atlantis. Appreciate you. Thank you very much for those messages. Otherwise, you can continue engaging with us on at Newzroom 405 with some of your thoughts. We're going to continue next to interrogate the COSATU Congress and why this is a headache for President Cyril Ramaphosa. Stay with us.